All right. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are joining us from today. Thank you so much for giving some of your time today for what is going to be an incredible closing plenary for our second day of this wonderful conference. I am Lauren Rabinowitz, Program Director at the Center of Excellence, and I have the distinguished pleasure of introducing Dr. Walter Gilliam. He has graciously allowed me to read a short bio, though there are not enough accolades present on a page, but I'm going to start here. So Walter Gilliam is the Elizabeth Mears and House Jameson Professor of Child Psychiatry and Psychology at the Yale University Child Study Center and Director of the Edward Ziegler Center in Child Development and Social Policy. Dr. Gilliam is Vice President of 0 to 3, a past President of Child Care Aware of America, a Board Director for the Irving Harris Foundation, First Children's Finance and All Our Kin, and a former Senior Advisor to the National Association for the Education of Young Children. He's frequently quoted in major national and international news outlets and actively provides consultation and invited testimony to decision makers in the US and other countries. He was co-recipient of the prestigious 2008 Gromeyer Award in Education for the co-authored book, A Vision for Universal Preschool Education. I am delighted to invite Dr. Gilliam to begin, and just to let everyone know, we will be saving questions for the end. There will be ample time. Well, ample is not the right word. We will save some time for questions and discussion. Please put them in the Q&A section, and we will get as many of them answered as possible. So thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you very much, Lauren, for the introduction. I hope that you can hear me okay. If you can't, then somebody please give me an audible so that I'll know. So thank you so much for inviting me here to speak with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about COVID-19 and the stress and trauma that COVID-19 has created on children, families, and the amazing, wonderful people who take care of those children and families every day, those caregivers, and also on you. We've all been suffering through this pandemic and all the things that this pandemic has brought with it. We'll also talk a little bit about racial aggression and bias, and why the work that you do in infant and early childhood mental health consultation is needed now more than any other time. So, oops, let's see. Okay, there we go. So I've been studying, as some of you may know, children being expelled from preschool programs for quite some time. And in a way, when you think about children being expelled from preschool programs, it really is kind of like studying the canary in the coal mine. When a child is expelled from a childcare program, one, it's like the canary in the coal mine. It's not the canary's fault. It's because of something going on in the environment that is causing this to happen. But the other thing too that you can tell too is that, you know, when children get expelled from preschool programs, it's because of something that's systemic that could and should be addressed, because it's going to eventually affect everybody, you know, and that's why I think that it's important to be thinking about children being expelled from childcare programs, or suspended or otherwise limited in terms of their participation. It's important because of the impacts of those children, but it's also important because when children get expelled and suspended and otherwise limited from their participation in programs, it's an indication that something is going awry, something that an infant and early childhood mental health consultant might be called in to do something about. So when we think about children being expelled or suspended or told to go home early or told to only come on certain days, we can think about the harm that it causes children now. And then we can also think about the harm that it causes later. At the very least, right now, what it does is it means that this child's not in early education. They're not coming, they're not learning, they're not getting an opportunity to be able to participate with other children, and it undermines maybe even the family's relationship with school and education. For many of these kids, this is the first contact that they're going to have with a school-like environment. They're essentially negotiating their relationship with school. And if that relationship in an early childhood program, childcare program, Head Start program, pre-K program is not a good one, then ultimately that might be the way in which their whole relationship with education going forward might be, because again, that's their first one. It also obscures the root causes that we could be and should be addressing. If there's a child whose behavior is so severe and concerning that they can't be in a child care program, shouldn't we be doing something to try to figure out what's going on and providing some kind of support if supports are necessary, either for that child or for the program maybe that's creating a poor fit. And it also can calcify the kind of biases that we might have in our mind about who it is that we serve, who it is that we don't serve, who it is that we provide extra supports in order to be able to make sure that they're able to participate, but also who it is for whom we deny those supports because we just essentially ask them to leave. And you can also think about the harms that can be created later. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. When I think about the rates at which children are expelled from preschool programs, I'm reminded back of the first study that we did back in 2005 was when we released it. It was the first study of children being expelled in pre-K programs nationally. And what we ultimately found was that compared to K through 12, preschoolers and 3 and 4-year-olds are more likely to be expelled. When childcare, oh my goodness, childcare, you're talking about now 13 times the rate of grades K through 12 combined. Pre-K about 3 times the rates of K through 12. Childcare about 13 times. When you put it all together and think about how many children do we expel and suspend from preschool programs again. Now we're talking about children under the age of 5. We're really young children. How many children a year is that get expelled or suspended? Well, based on the best estimates that are out there right now, about 192,000 every single year. You could fill every single seat in MetLife Stadium, Yankee Stadium, and Citi Field where the Mets play. Every single seat with an expelled preschooler, and you wouldn't be able to hold them all in a year. You'd have about 13,000 more of them sitting in the parking lot because they didn't have a place to sit. That's how many children we expel every single year or suspend in our early care and education programs. So who is it that's more likely to get expelled or suspended? Even going back to the first study that we did back in 2005, one thing that we learned was that in mixed age groups where you have 3s and the 4s together, the 4 is more likely to be expelled than the 3-year-old. Basically the larger kid. If a child is larger, they tend to be more likely to be expelled than if a child is smaller. When we ask teachers as to why that is, like oftentimes in research, people like me, we do our studies and we put out our findings and we make guesses and assumptions as to what the findings might mean. But really the best thing to do is when you're not quite sure what a finding means is get together the people that you got the finding from and ask them. And so that's what we did. We put together some preschool teachers and we said, this is a finding that we found that when we have mixed age groups and 3 and 4-year-olds together, that it's the 4-year-old that's more likely to be expelled or suspended than the 3-year-old, even if they're engaging in the same behavior. Why is that? And what they said back to us is that, well, when a larger child misbehaves, then it feels different. Well, what do you mean it feels different? And they said, well, if a larger child misbehaves, then and it's not a smaller child, then maybe that larger child will hurt somebody. And interestingly, and it makes sense what they were saying, but interestingly, what it also means is that what they were literally saying, if you listen to them, is it's not what the child's doing, it's the fear that might create as to what could happen as a result of that. So it's not really the behavior that got the child expelled, it's the fear that behavior could result in another child getting harmed. Or getting hurt. If a smaller child is doing the exact same thing, it doesn't quite seem so scary. And once we start to realize that it's really about like our thoughts about the behavior, not the behavior itself, that ultimately was the conversation that opened up our entire discourse regarding preschool and expulsion and the role of bias. Because ultimately what the teachers were saying is, again, it wasn't the behavior, it was what I thought about the behavior. And once we realize that it's what we think about the behavior, that really changes the entire ballgame in terms of understanding it. So what did we also find out from that very first study? That our Black preschoolers were expelled at a rate more than twice that of white preschoolers, that boys are expelled at about 4 times the rate of girls. And when you put it all together, basically there's 3 B's of preschool expulsion risk: big, Black, And boy, and the more of those that existed within a single child, the greater the likelihood was that that child would be asked to leave the program because of their behavior. Now, note that I'm not saying the greater the likelihood that the child will be misbehaving, or the greater the likelihood that the child will have serious misbehaviors. What I'm saying is the greater the likelihood that the response to that misbehavior will be asking the child to leave the program. That's what we ultimately found. So the U.S. Department of Education got involved after the findings came out, ran their own studies and surveys asking about preschool expulsion in school-based settings, and ultimately found exactly what it was that we had found roughly 10 years earlier. So there's lots of different ways to think about things like how do you understand preschool expulsion and what can you compare it to? One thing that I suppose you could compare it to is adult incarceration. And one argument that I have for thinking about it is this, in preschool expulsion, children don't just cease to exist. They're just not in the classroom. I mean, their child's still someplace, they're just kicked out of the society of the preschool classroom. And to a large degree, that's the same thing that happens in adult incarceration. When you incarcerate adults, they don't cease to exist. They just aren't in the greater society. They're placed someplace else. And so from that standpoint, there are some similarities. And people do talk about the preschool to prison pipeline or the cradle to prison pipeline. So let's test out some basic numbers to see whether or not there might be any useful thinking about this as a preschool to prison pipeline. So here's what we know in front of you in terms of the rate per 1,000 children enrolled by which children are expelled or suspended from preschool programs, based on teacher report, based on parent report. So what is the rate at which we incarcerate adults in the United States based on the same scale of 1 per 1,000? Well, it's about the same, not much difference really. And what's perhaps even more telling though is this. Let's look at the gender and race disparities. So on the left here, you'll see the rate at which boys are more likely to be suspended from a preschool program or expelled from a preschool program compared to girls. Roughly about 4 times as likely based on whether you're surveying teachers or schools or the parents. So what is the difference in terms of the more likelihood that a man is going to be incarcerated versus a woman? Well, kind of about the same, a little bit higher, but not too much different. Men are about 5.8 times as likely to be incarcerated than women, and boys are about 4 or point something as likely to be expelled or suspended from preschool programs as girls. So let's look also then perhaps at race. So here's the greater likelihood that Black children are to be expelled or suspended from a preschool program as opposed to white children. They're about 2 to 3 times as likely. So what is the increased likelihood of Black individuals versus white individuals in terms of adult incarceration in the United States? Well, kind of about the same. In other words, the very same children that we choose to exclude from early care and education programs in their preschool years tend to be the exact same demographic of individuals that we choose to exclude from the greater society in the form of adult incarceration. Almost identical, at almost identical rates of disparity too. And I suppose that doesn't in and of itself prove that there's a preschool to prison pipeline. But if there is a preschool to prison pipeline, it's amazing how consistent the diameter of the pipe is, all the way from preschool to adult incarceration. Very same children becoming the very same adults. So let's think about it in terms of a few other things too. What do we know about what preschool expulsion predicts later on, or what do we know about early expulsion from early childhood, early elementary school years and what that predicts? Well, we know that when children are expelled or suspended early on in their educational career, they tend to be more likely to develop negative school attitudes. I don't like school as much. And, who would blame them? Schools basically given up on them already. We also know that early expulsions and suspensions tend to predict later academic failure and grade retention, later expulsion and suspension, which is interesting as a finding. One of the best predictors of being expelled and suspended is having been expelled or suspended before. And from that finding alone, you can tell this: if preschool expulsion and suspension are designed to actually try to change a child's behavior, well, it ain't working, because if it were working, then we wouldn't need to be relying on it so much with the exact same children. We also know that children who are expelled and suspended early on are at about a 10-fold increased likelihood of dropping out of high school, about an 8-fold increased likelihood of being incarcerated later. And here's the kicker. Here's an interesting finding from a 2019 study. The children of incarcerated parents are 3 times greater risk of being expelled from preschool, which is interesting when you think about it, because what we were talking about before were all the things that might result as, happen as a result of being expelled or suspended. And then when a child is expelled or suspended, they're more likely to be incarcerated. And then they're very same children of those now incarcerated adults who used to be the expelled preschoolers are now at risk at a greater level of being expelled from preschool themselves. So you can think about it this way. You have a child who might be at risk of being expelled from an early care and education program. And of course, that's places them in a much greater risk of dropping out of school, which places them at a greater risk of incarceration. And then when they themselves have a child, then that child is at greater risk of all those things too. And the cycle just keeps repeating itself over and over again. Perhaps it's not really a preschool to prison pipeline. It's a preschool to prison corkscrew that keeps going right around in a circle over and over and over again. And if we really want to do something about it, then we need to find a place to disrupt that cycle. And where I would suggest disrupting it is right there. If we can disrupt it right there, then we can stop an awful lot of pain and agony later on for these children and their families and their communities. So what else is it that we know about preschool expulsion and suspension? There was a study that was done by Zhang and company back in 2019. And they were looking at ACEs, early childhood, adverse childhood experiences. And they were asking about early childhood adverse experiences, and they were looking specifically at the relationship between these various different ACEs and the likelihood that a preschooler would be expelled in the home. And what they ultimately found was that every single ACE that they looked at had an increased odds ratio associated with a preschool expulsion. In other words, preschoolers who were in a home with domestic violence were at about a 10.5-fold increased likelihood of being expelled from preschool. When there's mental illness in the family, then those children, those preschoolers, are at about a 10-fold increased likelihood of being expelled from preschool. Adult substance abuse, you can read the list yourself there. All of these things increasing the likelihood that a child is going to be expelled from a preschool program if they're enrolled in one. And what's interesting in a way when you think about it is many of these ACEs are really about a child not having a stable relationship with their parent, with their family member, either because of domestic violence or because of mental illness, making it difficult for the parents to be, creating a strong relationship and a bond with their child, adult substance abuse, parental divorce, parental incarceration, all the things that get in the way of sustaining a solid relationship between a child and the child's caregivers. And then how do we respond to that? Well, we also then make sure that they don't get the opportunity to have a stable relationship with their paid caregivers either, because they're going to be at a greater risk of being expelled from a preschool program. So what else is it that we know about preschool expulsion and suspension? Going way back to some of our early studies, we know that job stress is related to preschool expulsion and suspension. Regardless of the behavior of the child, the more stressed the teacher feels, the greater the likelihood that that teacher is going to expel a child in her care. And we also know that teachers who screen positive for depression expel at about twice the rate as teachers who screen negative for depression. So it's not just really about the child and the child's behavior, it's also about how we adults feel, how we feel about ourselves, and how that might impact the way in which we view that child's behavior. So what is it that we know about today? Well, let me tell you what we know from some studies that we've been conducting of over 126,000 early care and education providers all across the United States. My team and I, we started doing epidemiological surveys of the state of the early care and education workforce starting from like 2 months into the pandemic, and we've been continuing to collect data. We now have about 126,000 that have participated in these different epidemiological studies. And so from that, I'm going to tell you some of the things that we've been learning. Some of these things we've already released. Some of these are not even out yet. So you're getting a chance to hear about it first from us, I suppose. So as of August 2021, and again, that's several months ago, so these numbers are going to probably be much higher now. About 21% of our early care and education providers had tested positive for COVID-19. About 3% have actually been hospitalized for COVID-19 during the pandemic. Of those hospitalized, a little bit more than half of them has spent time in the ICU or were intubated. About 2% have had a family member who was hospitalized. Just under 1% had a family member who has died of COVID-19 during the pandemic. That's an awful lot of loss and illness that's being experienced by our early care and education providers. 35 months into the pandemic, or I'm sorry, 3 months into the pandemic, 35% of the early care and education workforce was completely out of a job. They were unemployed. And then when we looked at those who were employed between May of 2020 and 15 months later, August 2021, about 54% of them had been closed at least temporarily at some point because of the pandemic. And we're talking about, early care and education providers here. Most of them are not in the public school. They're not usually salaried. They're mostly hourly workers. And so when their program's closed, in many cases, they don't get paid. So if the program's closed for a few days, they don't get paid for a few days. A few weeks, they don't get paid for a few weeks. And for some of us, not getting paid for a few days or a few weeks, we can recover from that. But not if you're getting paid what an early care and education provider is getting paid. In those cases, it's really difficult to recover from it because they're just not paid well enough to begin with. We also know that more than a quarter of them were not working at all between March 2020 and July 2020, early on in the pandemic. About 9% of them during that period of time were laid off or the program was closed. And of those who were laid off, about 12% of them were laid off and had absolutely no medical insurance in the middle of a global pandemic. We also know, because we were asking questions about their health conditions, what kind of health conditions they might have been dealing with during the pandemic. And you can see this list here. I'll not read it all off to you, but one of the things that was interesting to us, that jumped out to us, was the asthma rate, which is about 20% higher than the asthma rate for women in general during this time. Which then raises the question, of course, do we know enough about moderate to severe asthma within this population? Depression rates. Now here's where it gets, I think, really specific to the work that you do. We asked the teachers to fill out the Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale 10-item version, and also the Perceived Stress Scale 10-item version to measure depression and to measure stress, both of those. At the beginning of the pandemic, 2 months into the pandemic, 46% of the nation's early care and education providers, out of a sample of over 81,000, 46% of them screened positive for depression. I'm not saying 46% of them said that I'm sad every once in a while. I'm saying 46% of them screened in the positive range for diagnosable levels of depression on a validated measure that's used to estimate actual depression rates in a population. 46%. And 15 months later, that 46% was no longer 46%, it was 56%. 56% of the nation's early care and education providers, well over half of them, screening positive for depression. And it's quite possible that when we go back into the field and collect more data after August 2021, we're planning on going back again next month, that those rates might be continuing those trajectories, and they could be even higher. Stress rates just through the roof, and it's impossible to overstate what it means when 56% of the nation's early care and education providers are perhaps clinically depressed. And there's a ton of research on the relationship between maternal and paternal depression, on the relationship between parents and children. And everything that we know suggests that that's probably also true if those caregivers are the paid caregivers and not just the biological or the familiar caregivers. What do we know about depression rates based on the race of the educator? Well, 40 at the beginning of the pandemic, 46% overall, and you can see that the higher rates were among those who identified as multiracial and also those who identified as American Indian. And then you can see how it goes from there. What about stress rates? Those that screened positive for not moderate but severe levels of stress. High levels of stress for Asian Americans. And again, bear in mind, we were first collecting this 2 months into the pandemic, a little bit before media started covering anti-Asian hate that was happening within communities. And it's quite possible that that's really what we were capturing there, was the stress that they were experiencing from that. So you take all of what we just talked about and you add in some racial aggression. And then what do you ultimately get at that point? So we started asking some questions in some of our later surveys, specifically about the amount of racialized aggression that early care and education providers might be experiencing. Have you ever experienced racialized aggression, either verbally or physically, during the course of the pandemic? And when we asked that question, 29% of them said yes, they've experienced, and we defined, racialized aggression, what that meant, and verbal or physical, either one would count. And 29% of them said yes, they've experienced that. And you can see how it breaks down by the race of the early care and education provider, with African American providers reporting the most of it, followed by multiracial identifying early care and education providers and Asian American ones. So that's when we asked about it overall. When we asked about it more specifically, like, were you the direct target of the racialized aggression that you experienced in one way or another? About 8% said yes, they were the direct target of racialized aggression, either physically or verbally during the pandemic at some time. And you can see that the greater rates experienced by African American early care and education providers, Asian American early care and education providers. What about just witnessing it? The profile changes a little bit from there. Similar in some respects, but multiracial becomes a lot more likely to witness it, perhaps because they're spanning multiple racial groups, because that's how they're identifying. What about those who reported somebody close to them experiencing physical or verbal racialized aggression? Well, then these are the rates for that too. So we're talking about a lot of our early care and education providers that not only are feeling the stress that are particular to caring for young children, but they're also experiencing the stress that everybody in society is experiencing too. And they're going to carry that to their classrooms as well. We asked us about some, open-ended questions about, can you describe what it was like and what you experienced? And we've been playing around with some word clouds and doing some qualitative analysis of some of the responses that we've gotten back. It's like thousands and thousands of qualitative descriptions of it, trying to figure out what the best themes are. And if I come back and present to you again, I'll give you some more details on what it is that we're learning from that. So what about the effect of the pandemic on the children themselves? Well, in terms of just the amount of trauma that they're experiencing, when we asked early care and education providers if any child, one or more of the children in their classroom, had ever had a family member hospitalized with COVID-19. By June of this past year, 24% said yes, at least one of the children in my care has had a family member who's been hospitalized with COVID-19, with about 18% of them saying that 5 or more of them. And these may sound like a lot of numbers, and they might sound like an awful lot of children with family members being hospitalized. And in fact, quite a few children do have family members who are hospitalized. And whatever the rate of that is, multiply that rate by the number of children in the care of that early care and education provider. And that becomes a closer approximation of the likelihood that early care and education provider is going to come into contact with a child bringing that kind of stress into their early care and education setting. And then also bear in mind that many of our early care and education settings were open because they were open specifically for essential workers. And in other words, they were taking care of the children of families who were more likely to carry COVID-19 burden, simply because they were the essential workers, making it possible for others like me to largely be able to do their work at home. They were taking the burden and the stress in place of others. And as a result of that, they were more likely to get sick. And many of our early care and education providers, what they were the essential workers that made all the other essential work possible. They were keeping their programs open, some of the times at the expense of themselves and at Herculean levels of effort, in order to be able to make it possible for other people to go to work. And as a result of that, they ended up seeing an awful lot of trauma coming into their program, because many of the families that they were helping were families that were carrying a very heavy burden of COVID-19. So what about the likelihood that they would have a child in their care who's actually had a family member who's died of COVID-19? Well, 12% said at least one of their children over the course of the pandemic has had at least one family member die of COVID-19. 7% of them said 5 or more. And this was by June of last year. I have no idea what the rate is right now, but my guess is it's going to be higher than that. What about when we ask them whether or not the children in their care are more likely to be more externalizing? In other words, more acting out, more aggressive, more hyperactive, more internalizing. In other words, more likely to be shy or withdrawn, clingy, crying, or more likely to be showing stress in their body in terms of sleep disturbances or eating disturbances or unexplained aches and pains. And when we asked about this, 64% said at least some of the children are more externalizing, more acting out than they would have expected before the pandemic. Of that, 42% said a few of the children are like that, a few or more of them. And 22% said half or more of the children in their care. Half or more. About a quarter of our early care and education providers are saying that half or more of the children in their care have more externalizing behaviors than they would have expected from before the pandemic. And the rates are a little close to that, not too off when you're talking about shy and withdrawn and clingy and all those other things. And then what about the somaticizing concerns, which in some respects might even be more severe, more concerning, when a child is literally showing stress in their body and the way in which their body behaves. About 50% of them, 49%, reporting that the children are more somaticizing than what they would have expected before the pandemic. So when you put it all together, what we had known before the pandemic was that when children and families are stressed out, and you multiply that by the stress that teachers are experiencing, that's the formula for expulsions, which then, of course, raises the question during COVID-19 of, well, what if you multiply the stress that children and families are experiencing, and you multiply the stress that teachers are experiencing, because these teachers are human too. They're going through exactly all the same stressors that everybody else, the children and the families and the communities that they're serving, they're going through that too. When you increase the amount of stress on both sides of that, well, then I wouldn't expect just an additive effect in terms of the amount of expulsions happening. I would expect that that's going to really skyrocket and drastically increase the likelihood that a child's going to be expelled from a preschool program, even in addition to what we were experiencing before the pandemic. So I was just on a listserv not too long ago, and this was something that an early child care provider had posted on the listserv, essentially asking a question about, can you remind me what the rules are for how to expel a child from my classroom? So you take all of that I just mentioned, and then add in some racial bias. And then what do you get? So what are racial biases? Well, biases are the assumptions and the expectations that we make, and these assumptions and expectations are based on representations, what our mind might think regarding, what does a child who is likely to cause problems look like? What about the teacher's pet? What does that child look like? And these representations that we might have in our mind can impact the way in which we view a child's behaviors. That's what we had learned before. So, there's lots of different ways that I can describe what a bias is, but I think one way that is sometimes helpful is to provide a riddle. Describe it through a riddle. So here's a riddle, in case you haven't heard it, but it's quite possible that you've heard it before. So if you've heard it before, please just bear with me. So in the riddle, there's two men, a father and a son, who were in a car and they're driving down the road, and unfortunately there's a terrible accident, and the father dies immediately on the scene, and the son is taken to the hospital for emergency medical care. He's in life-threatening condition, and they contact the top surgeon at the hospital. because the condition of the son is so terrible. And the top surgeon in the hospital comes there, and the top surgeon in the hospital is scrubbing in, and the nurses have already scrubbed in, and the nurses have the patient ready, and the nurses have the patient in the operating room, and then the top surgeon comes out, and the surgeon looks down at the patient, looks up at the nurses and says, "I can't do this surgery. That's my son." And when you tell a riddle like that to a lot of people, they say, well, how could that possibly be true? How can that be the surgeon's son when the father died in the automobile accident? And it's amazing how difficult it is sometimes for people to be able to come to the most easy answer, perhaps, which is that, well, maybe the top surgeon in the hospital is his mother. Maybe that's why, but for many people, it's just very hard to imagine that the top surgeon in the hospital could be a man, because that's how biases work too. It has to do with the image we have in our head or the image we don't have in our head regarding what a certain person would be like, look like, act like. That's what a bias ultimately is. If the image that we had in America regarding what the top surgeon in a hospital looked like was something like this, if that was the image that we predominantly had in our mind, well, I'd have to tell the riddle in a completely different way. I'd have to tell it like this. There were two women driving down the road, a mother and a daughter. That's how I'd have to tell the riddle if what you see in front of you right now was the predominant image that most of us have regarding what the top surgeon in a hospital would look like. So with all of that in mind, we decided a few years ago to do a study on implicit bias in preschool classrooms to see whether or not there might be a bias regarding who we expect to misbehave in an early care and education classroom. So what we did in the study was really kind of simple. We had a video, it was about 6 minutes long. We fitted the teachers with eye tracking devices that could tell us down to a pixel and down to about 1,000th of a second exactly where on the screen they were looking at any given moment. And we told them that the secret to being able to manage challenging behaviors is to be able to see a challenging behavior before it becomes too problematic. I want you to watch this video. We're going to track your eyes and know exactly where you're looking. And anytime you see a child do something that could turn into a challenging behavior, I want you to hit this button. That's what we told the teachers. What we didn't tell the teachers was this: none of the children are going to misbehave. And the reason that we know that is because all of these children are essentially child actors that we've hired and placed at a table. A black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And that their acting job for the day is to play with Play-Doh. And we want you to watch this video, and we're going to be tracking your eyes, but we're not really caring where you find the challenging behaviors because there aren't any to find. What we're really interested in is this. This is what we didn't tell them. What we're interested in is, where do you look when I lead you to believe that a child's going to misbehave? That's ultimately how we set up the experiment. And just to give you a sense of what it looked like, we recreated. I'm going to show you the video right now. You can see basically the children are just there. You can hear some background noise. The background noise we actually typed in. You can go to Amazon apparently and buy something called typical preschool noises. So if you don't have enough typical preschool noises in your day, go to Amazon and you can buy some, just like we did. And then we layered it into the video in order to make it seem more realistic. They were actually the only children in the classroom when we filmed this. So to give you a sense of what it looked like, we recreated it. You can see a preschool teacher there. She's watching the video. Here's another preschool teacher. She's watching the video too. You see the little black bar, that's the eye tracker. That's Maria. She was a research assistant with us. She sees the exact same video that the preschool teachers are looking at, except in her video, there's a yellow dot. That yellow dot is where the teacher is looking right now. And by knowing exactly where the teacher's looking at every single moment, we can go frame by frame and identify exactly where the teacher's looking after we've led them to believe that a child might misbehave. And what we ultimately found when we watched their eyes, and when we even later on asked them, who do you think you had to watch the most, was very interesting. But instead of me telling you what it is that we found, I thought it might be more interesting for you to hear it from CNN's Van Jones, who did a segment specifically on implicit bias and covered the work that we had done in order to help explain what implicit bias is. So here is Van Jones of CNN talking to us about implicit bias and telling you a little bit about some of the findings that we found in our Yale study.
This week, more than 8,000 Starbucks stores actually closed up shop so that employees could take racial bias training after two black men were arrested at a Philadelphia store for Well, for actually no good reason at all. And that was one of several incidents of bias that have been caught on tape just recently. At Yale, my alma mater, a white graduate student called the cops to report a black woman napping in a dorm common area. Turns out the black woman was also a student who had fallen asleep after a long night of studying. In Rialto, California, a woman called the police on a group of 3 black friends who were checking out of their Airbnb. The woman told the cops she thought the group was suspicious because they didn't wave at her. So then in Oakland, a woman called police on a black family because they were barbecuing in the park and were using the wrong grill. So look, there is no question this is a troubling trend, but sadly, these types of interactions are not new. We just live in a day and age where everybody's got a camera phone and they can record this type of stuff. So does that mean, though, that all these white people calling the cops on minorities are a bunch of intentionally hateful bigots? Well, maybe some of them are, but most likely, not all of them. I think something else is at play here. Implicit bias. What is implicit bias? I studied it. Take a look. If I say you have implicit bias, please don't take offense. Because everybody has implicit bias. We're talking subconscious perceptions of the world around you. If I say peanut butter, you don't think ketchup. Ew. Nope, you automatically think jelly. Yay. And the same with salt and pepper, green eggs and ham.
Do you like green eggs and ham?
All of these associations are shaped by everything from your upbringing and experiences to images in the media. Watching TV and film characters based on racial and ethnic stereotypes helps shape our instant associations about people. And those unconscious judgments that start off early and build up over time can have real consequences on everything from your success in getting a job, your interactions with the police, your ability to find housing. Now, let's talk about 2 professions that everybody agrees are full of well-intentioned people, doctors and teachers. Studies find that doctors are about half as likely to prescribe pain medication to black patients versus white patients with the same reported level of pain. Studies show unconscious stereotypes may be causing doctors to just underestimate the level of pain felt by their black patients. Now, black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white peers. Consider this. Yale researchers asked teachers to watch videos of kids in a classroom and identify any problematic behavior. Each video featured a black girl and boy and a white girl and boy. The catch? There was no bad behavior in any video. And yet, 42% of teachers identified the black boy as the child who was the most challenging. Researchers found that teachers' eye movements actually followed the black boys in the video the most closely. Another study finds that having a stereotypically black-sounding name makes people imagine someone bigger and more violent. So that's the bad news. And look, to be sure, there are some people who are still just flat out old-fashioned racists. You know, they don't like people of color and they want to exclude us or cause us harm. But even if you don't fall into that category, please don't be so quick to exonerate yourself. Because it turns out that racial bias functions kind of like malware, like a computer virus in our brain that kind of causes a subtle glitch whenever the input is a dark-skinned face. So you may not be racist, but your brain probably is. And the first step is admitting that all of us may have picked up a bad virus or 2 along the way. And we can do something about that. Look, I'm Van Jones. It's the Van Jones Show. Thank you for watching. Peace and love for one another.
So that's how Van Jones described what it was that we had found. And just to, remind you, what we basically found was that teachers, both black and white alike, spent most time watching black children when they were led to believe that a child might misbehave. And in particular, the black boy. So they watched black children in generally more, but also specifically the black boy, waiting for this bad behavior that never really came. And they knew that they were doing it. When we asked them who they thought that they were watching the most, they felt that they were watching the black boy the most. And so what's interesting about this, I think, is that when you really think about it, if you expect challenging behaviors to happen here with this child, and that's where you're looking for them, well, then of course, that's where you're going to find them. You're going to find them there. You're not going to find them over here in the other direction because that's not where you're looking. So wherever we expect things to happen is probably where we're going to find them happening, because that's where we're expecting and that's where we're therefore looking. And that's how biases basically operate. So that's what we found with this study. When you think about children, especially being expelled from preschool programs or kicked out of early care and education programs or suspended from childcare, or however you want to term it, when you think social justice and civil rights, those are usually about access. They're about your ability to be able to get access to something, to be involved in something. And access can mean access to a seat on the bus or a seat at a deli counter. Access can mean access to voting or access to higher education, or it can also mean access to elementary school. And in this case, we're talking about access to early childhood education programs. But access isn't just getting in the front door. It's also about making sure you're not pushed out the back door too. I was giving testimony a few years ago for the House Appropriations Subcommittee that had specific jurisdiction over early childhood education programs. I was there supposedly to talk about, where we should be putting and prioritizing funding in early care and education. But I was asked a question that I wasn't necessarily expecting, and it came from an appropriator who asked about preschool expulsion, suspension, and racial disproportionality in it. And I didn't really have an answer prepared for a question like that, but here's how I winged it at the moment when I was asked essentially, why should we care so much about the racial disproportionality in children being expelled from preschool programs?
In terms of the race issue and the gender issue, it is very disturbing that that was found. But to be honest with you, that's what we found about 10 years ago when we first released these reports in 2005, that African-American children were expelled at twice the rate of non-African-American children, boys about 4 times the rate. What concerns me the most about this is this. We talked in this one hearing here about the Perry Preschool Project, Abecedarian. We didn't talk about the Chicago Child Parent Centers, but that's the other cost-benefit analysis report that people use to justify early care and education programs. In many presentations, I've asked people what they know about the Perry Preschool Project sample. And it's amazing. People know the year, they know how many children, they know what city it was, Ypsilanti, Michigan. But consistently, I never get the answer that, and they were all black. And that's true. Every one of them. Abecedarian, 98% African American. Chicago Child Parent Centers, overwhelmingly African American. We have in this country purchased early care and education for all of our children on data that belong to African American children. And then when nobody's looking, we disproportionately expel them out the back door. And it creates 2 major problems. One is that it basically undercuts the investment potential in early care and education, because you're expelling from and removing from the program the children most likely to give you your return on investment. And 2, it is just simply not fair, and it's not American, to use their data to create a program for all of us and then disproportionately expel them out the back door. Thank you for asking the question.
You wanted to
May I just mention that in Oklahoma, we do use some quality funds from our CCDGB grant to support mental health consultation in child care centers. We have a statewide system network for that.
That's really disturbing. Oh, yeah.
Did you hear the one appropriator say that's really disturbing? I agree with her. It is really disturbing that we basically take data that belong to our Black children, families, and communities, use it to be able to create a program for the benefit of all of us, and then disproportionately disenfranchise from that same program the children, families, and communities who gave us the data in the first place to create the program. But that ultimately is what we're doing with racially disparate rates of children being kicked out of our early care education programs. So moving along from there, I don't want to leave you with a note like that, because I want to leave you with a more positive note. And here's the more positive note. We know things that can work. We've now done 2 random controlled trials statewide in 2 different states, Connecticut and then in Ohio, that show that early care and education programs that receive early childhood mental health consultation have significant improvements. So in Connecticut, what we did was we did a random controlled trial, randomizing programs to either receive the intervention, early childhood mental health consultation. In other words, receive what it is that many of you on this webinar do every day. And other ones were placed on a wait list because the program was oversubscribed anyway. And so you could ethically do that. So we randomized a treatment or wait list group. And what we ultimately found was that in just 3 months of a fairly intensive, but fairly brief early childhood mental health consultation program, that there were significant improvements in the target children, the children whose behaviors prompted the request for the intervention, significant improvements in their behaviors. In Ohio, we set up the study similarly and was also statewide, but we had one little twist in it. Not only did we look at whether or not the intervention improved children's behaviors when the child was the child who prompted the request for the intervention, but we also randomly selected bystander children in the classroom to see what might be the impact of the mental health consultation on their behaviors. And what we found in Ohio was similar to Connecticut. The children who prompted the request for the early intervention program for the early childhood mental health consultation, their behaviors improved, but so also did the bystander children. Their behaviors improved too. And when you have as much need as exists as right now, we will never, my friends, have enough early care and education consultants, early childhood mental health consultants, to be able to help every single child and family and program who needs it one at a time. We need to be able to do things that leave behind residual benefits that benefit all of the children. And that's why I like early childhood mental health consultation, because it's not attempting to pull children out of a classroom and do mental health magic in the hallway and then put them back. It's trying to do something within the system, within that classroom, within that teacher, that can change the way in which that teacher interacts, not only with that child, but with all the children. That's the kind of interventions we need if we ever want to be able to get ahead of the 8 ball when we're thinking about this much trauma and this much need that exists. Unfortunately, not everybody gets early childhood mental health consultation. We asked in our studies, remember those epidemiological studies I was talking about earlier? We also asked them about their access to mental health consultation. In Head Start programs, about 43% said they had some access to mental health consultation. Only about 11%, 10.7% said regular access. That should be about 100% though, because that's actually in the performance standards that they're supposed to be getting this access. But nonetheless, they had more than anybody else, but it wasn't the 100% that they should be getting. In the public schools, they had more than the child care centers. In the child care centers, about 18% had some kind of access they felt, but only 2 had regular access. 15% said that they thought that they could get it if they had asked for it, and many of those who reported that they thought that they could receive access, many of them reported that they thought it would take a long time before they actually received that access. We took a look at it based on whether or not the classroom was comprised mostly of children of color or mostly children who are non of color, or mostly children who are white. And what we ultimately found was that when you compared May 2020 to August 2021, 15 months later in the pandemic, classrooms that were majority white children, their access to mental health consultation stayed about the same. We actually increased access over that period of time to classrooms that were serving a majority children of color. And that's a good thing, because I've already shown you that it's our families of color that are carrying the heavier burden of COVID-19 anyway. Their children are going to be having the heavier burden and trauma of it. The programs that are serving more children of color are going to be carrying more burden of COVID-19 and its traumas, both in terms of the disease or the economic stress or the racialized aggression that's gone along with the pandemic. They're going to be carrying more of that, so they should be getting more assistance. And we can, I suppose, congratulate ourselves because we're serving a higher percentage now than we used to be in terms of access to mental health consultation in classrooms that were majority children of color. But take a look at those numbers. Take a look at the percentages there. What if I change the scale on the left? Instead of making it go from 0 to 10%, I make it go to 0 from 100%. And it's at that point that you can see that those exact same proportions basically mean that almost nobody has access to mental health consultation at the level that they should be having access. So I'm going to leave you right there by saying, summing it up, our early care and education providers and their children in their care are not doing well. Our early childhood professionals of color, especially, have been carrying the heavier burden, incredibly high levels of stress and depression, racialized aggression. I fully expect to see dramatic increases in the rates at which children are being expelled from our early care and education programs. And because of that, the work that you do every day could not be more needed than it is right now. But unfortunately, access to you and the work that you do is too little. So I'm going to say thank you to the funders who have funded us. I'm going to say thank you to over 126,000 amazing, wonderful human beings who care for our children every single day. And I'm going to say thank you for whatever it is that you do. If you're on this webinar, then I know that you care about children and you care for children and families and you care for those who care for them. And so for whatever it is that you do, I thank you.
Oh, this is another one of those moments I really wish we were all in one place, because I guarantee you that the applause would just be resounding. Thank you very much for that comprehensive. I mean, you covered so much, and I also think made it incredibly digestible and gave us all something we can take with us. So thank you for that. Not shockingly, we have lots of wonderful questions that have come into the chat. You've actually answered lots of them throughout the time, so we've been carefully monitoring the Q&A pod and sort of moving things around to try and make sure that that we are touching on something that maybe you didn't have quite as much time for. So I know we really just have a couple minutes left, so I think we're going to try and get to 2 questions. But thank you also to our participants who put in lots of other questions. But here's the first one. Has the research looked at any differences in rates of expulsion if the educator and/or program director was BIPOC themselves versus rates of expulsion for children whose teacher or director was white?
Great question. So early on, we did look at the exact question that you're asking regarding gender or sex. And the reason that we were able to do that was in part because we were getting lots of questions about why is it that boys are more likely to be expelled than girls, and the rates were like 4 times different. And we don't have very many men in the early care and education profession, unfortunately. But when we had a sample size as big as what we had in that first study of preschool expulsion suspension, even when you only have 2% men, it was still enough that we could take a look at the rates. What made it easy for us to look at the rates there was this. If you're a male teacher, about half the children in your care are going to be boys and about half of them are girls. And if you're a woman teacher, about half of them in your care are going to be boys and about half of them are girls. It was fairly easy then to be able to look at it. And we ultimately found that if you're a female early care and education provider, then the boys in your classroom were expelled at a rate more than 4 times that of girls. And the exact same thing was true if it was a man who was the teacher, exact same rates. And it was easy to do that again because gender was equally distributed regardless of the gender of the provider. What makes it hard to answer the question that you're asking right now, even though it's a great question, is that race is not equitably distributed on the basis of the race of the teacher. Teachers of color are much more likely to have children of color in their care. And if a provider is multilingual or a provider can speak Spanish, you can pretty much guarantee every Spanish-speaking child and family is going to be in that teacher's classroom. And so as a result, we don't typically distribute race and ethnicity the same way that we distribute gender when it comes to class composition, which makes it really difficult to be able to do the kind of analysis that you're asking for, even though the question is a great one. Although some people have looked at it in terms of just trying to look at change in their ratings of the severity of their behavior problems. And what they ultimately found is that children who are rated early on in the year in terms of challenging behaviors, and if that's a child of color, then if the teacher is also white, the ratings tend to go up. But if a teacher is a teacher of color, then the ratings tend to either stay static or they tend to go down. which does imply that teacher-child race does, in terms of a match, does indeed matter a lot. Now, where it gets a little bit tricky, and I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but it's a great question that you're asking. Where it gets a little tricky is this: how would you solve that? Well, of course, obviously, we need to be able to have more teachers of color that are more reflective of the children that they serve. And we also need to have more early childhood mental health consultants of color who are more reflective of the teachers that they support, reflective of the communities and children that they serve. But even then, you'd never have so much of a surplus that you could match everybody exactly on the basis of gender and race. Nor, I would argue, would you necessarily want to. Would you necessarily want to move to a purposefully segregated educational experience? You know, so it's a tricky issue. For me, I think the question ultimately boils down to this: how do we build as much diversity as we can, support as much diversity as we can, and then create the circumstances by which each and every one of us can benefit from that diversity, where white teachers are in teammanship with teachers of color, and they're learning from each other. And ultimately, that's how we can build a more equitable society. Hard work.
Extremely hard work, absolutely. And think, you know, in answering that question again, you touched on several of the other questions that, you know, we're all coming in very, very thematically organized. I do think we should close. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and of course yours, Walter. To everyone that put in questions that we didn't get to, please know that we have noted them. You've all really helped us at the Center of Excellence with our homework and next steps. So please don't misinterpret our not getting to your question as intentional. Just, you know, running short on.
Yeah, interpreted as me being too long-winded.
Not at all. Just that has been our only consistent theme, as we keep running out of time for all these amazing questions and all the thought and the considerations. So thank you so very much to everyone. As always, an enormous thank you to our technology team and their teams. We have tremendous number of individuals. We have interpreters, we have closed captioning, we have all sorts of accommodations and lots of great things happening behind the scenes to help get this content out to everyone. So always thank you to our huge team. Thank you again, Walter, and we really hope to see everyone tomorrow morning, 11 Eastern, for our second poster session. And we promise that we will have troubleshooted all the technology issues from that. And yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. So have a wonderful, restful evening tonight. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.